And we're back.
And we're back.
So we were talking a couple of days ago, and obviously I think we've both been having conversations with some of the pro players that we work with lately about kind of tools in terms of managing the mental side of the game.
Yes.
Obviously, there's a significant number of highly skilled tennis players out there, and oftentimes the mental emotional side of things has such a huge impact on not just actual matches performance, but preparation and just general approach to things, right?
Yeah, I mean that it affects everything, whether we want to admit it or not.
Yeah, and I think as a part of that conversation, I posited the potential conversation topic of who is quote unquote mentally tougher, Nadal or Djokovic, which I think gives us a framework to have a really great conversation about this aspect of what people term mental toughness, which I think is really a misnomer, right? I mean, I don't really like talking about players and people in terms of mental toughness. I think it's much
I,
more about kind of skills and strategies is much more how I'd prefer to frame things.
well, I'm curious to hear more about that, but I pretty much avoid talking about people's mental toughness unless I just like build up their mental toughness, like
Right.
regardless.
Yeah, well, I think that's right because I think it's very, very misleading because there's, I think, implied in the way a lot of people talk about mental toughness in the context of sports is the idea of mental toughness as some sort of an intrinsic characteristic of the person, that they're either mentally
Yeah.
tough or they're not. They're mentally tough or they're mentally weak, and it undercuts the very real fact that what we term as mental toughness is really comes down to, the sort of tools that somebody has access to, whether they were explicitly taught them or not, and how well they utilize those tools in kind of stressful situations. And I think that some people, just by nature of their experiences or kind of their default neurology, have a better starting point than others when it comes to these things, and then we attribute them with this attribute as though it's this kind of thing that is just a fact about them that's an unchanging aspect of their person.
Well, there's no doubt that people have a different starting point, right? Just like some people are taller, or some people are more explosive, or some people have better stamina. Like we're all just physiologically starting in different places.
And
Uh,
neurologically studying in different places too.
well, neurologically is subsumed within the set of physiologically, right? Like
Well, I
that's
think
part
it's
of
worth,
biology.
yeah, but I
Yeah,
think it is worth
absolutely,
stating explicitly though.
definitely. So I want to know, where do you want to start this off? Like, because we could start this off with like, okay, well, how do you define mental toughness to your players? Like, what does that conversation look like? Or do we jump in and just go like, all right, who's tougher, like Rafa or Novak?
Right. Well, I don't. I think to me, it's not really about having a conversation of who's tougher, because they're they deal with different circumstances, right? I mean, they have very different histories. They deal with very different circumstances, and so it's not like we're putting them in a 100 meter dash where the constraints are the same and the conditions are the same, and it's just go head to head. Yeah, we're talking about something that's very subjective, and where we don't really have a way or objective means which we should compare. But I think the reason it's an interesting topic to me is this. I look at those two players and we look at the tools and strategies that people can employ to manage their emotional and mental stature in matches and training, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that they have two very different approaches to this, and they have access to two very different tool sets. And, especially I think for me, Novak is a particularly fascinating one because of the ways in which he responds well in particularly adverse conditions, but then sometimes doesn't respond well in conditions that most people consider favorable. And I think that's an interesting in kind of I don't know, contrast. Whereas I think Nadal to me is this player who uses a lot of what we consider a lot of very of the traditional tools, right? Where
Right.
he has a lot of process and ritual around his tennis. We were obviously the water bottle situation is quite famous. The wedgie picking before he serves is a very well known aspect of his game. But those speak to his use of ritual for managing his mental and emotional state. And obviously, I think it's well known that he comes from a pretty stable family background. Obviously, growing up in Spain, he's not from a war-torn country where he's experienced these significant kind of cultural traumas. And so I look at Nadal, and it's somebody who I think is largely seems to be a pretty emotionally healthy human being who has access to and has utilized a lot of these traditional tools that athletes use in a variety of sports to kind of manage the way that they approach their matches. Right? But he's very professional and
Okay, so
classic.
that's all right. I want to know, do you have an emotional attachment to one of these answers or the other? Like if I say who's mentally tougher, Rafa or Novak?
I think I don't frame it like that. Like I said, you can't really compare them. I think that it's fascinating. It's a fascinating discussion to me, not in the context of who's tougher, but how they each go about exhibiting their mental toughness and the ways in which they utilize it. Right?
If
Because
somebody tries to back you into a corner and say like, "Hey, like who are you gonna have play if your life is on the line?"
depends. It depends. If you're talking about playing in front of a hostile crowd, it's Novak, right? He feeds off that. But if it's a if you want to put me in a different situation, it might be rougher. I mean, it's very situational because they respond differently to different stimuluses, right? And I think that's the fascinating part of the conversation to me, because if I look at Novak, a very different human being, and none of this is meant to be an indictment in Novak. I mean, he's grown up from a very different culture. His country's been through a lot in more recent history than Spain has, and so that has this kind of impact. We talk about kind of cultural trauma in a sense, right? That there's just a very different aspect to Novak, I think, where at least to me, it's clear that he desperately wants to be liked, but
Yeah.
then it's also clear to me that he feeds off being disliked in some ways. When it comes to the competitive arena, we've seen some of his best performance and best play when the crowd was against him, when he felt like he was in his hostile arena, and he's actively riled the crowd up against him at times, and
Yeah.
proverbially given the crowd the middle finger without physically actually giving them the middle finger in order to help foster this hostile environment that he then feeds off of to play well. And
He
I think
does
it's a
he
very
has
kind of fascinating thing.
he has verbally given the crowd the middle finger according to my
Sure.
survey. So they're like, yeah, he's just telling everyone off right now.
Right. No, absolutely he has.
And not too distant like past. But it's good when you speak a language that not everyone understands sometimes.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, look, how much do you think when he's surrounded by the hostility and he thrives, right? How much do you think he inhabits this sort of it's me against the world kind of like motivation?
I think 100%. I think that's very much the psychological driver there, right? I think it's him and his small little team against the world.
Well, sometimes it seems like it's him against his team.
Well, that's true too, for sure. And
That's actually, I think that speaks to your point, right? Because I've seen at times, I mean, he's obviously recently switched teams and gone back to some of his previous people, but say like when he was when he had Ivanisevic on his team, there were times where he would literally be going at Goran in the box, where he was
sure.
like, I'm gonna make Goran the enemy today. And it seemed to me like he needed almost that gladiator on the other side. He needed an enemy to get himself into, we'll say, like, what's the ideal mindset for him to play his best tennis.
Right.
It's not exactly like, oh, I'm going to be calm and happy and like, going to the petting zoo. Like he wanted to be worked up. I think he wanted to be highly aggressive. And so it seems like he was actually picking fights with his own team in order to do that. And he knows obviously like they're good friends and they're going to be on good terms and they both understand the dynamic. So it's not like he's really being a jerk to the guy, if that makes sense.
Sure. Well, I mean, yes, in a sense, he is being a jerk, and that's part of the point. But also, in a sense, there's like a shared understanding there where he's not damaging that relationship, or at least we would hope not. I think
Yeah, it
that's
seems like it was
maybe
like,
the
hey,
important distinction.
you're my temporary enemy, so I can get myself going, so I can go play better tennis.
Sure, and and to be clear, none of this is meant as any sort of a criticism of Novak or any sort of an observation on him in a negative way. I think it speaks to the fact that whatever it is in the circumstances in his life that have led him to this place where he responds to that, I think all great athletes have really a responsibility in a sense to find ways to create the right psychological state for them to perform
Yeah.
their best in the big moments. And the
Yeah.
goal hopefully would be that over time, with access to resources and hopefully good support structures, that they do so in a way that's emotionally healthy, right? That manages their relationships with themselves and the world.
Yeah. I mean, I think I want him to be an emotionally healthy person, you know, off the court. For me personally, like, I don't know that it matters. Like, it only matters the way that you need to get yourself going on the court, like the mindset that you need to play your best tennis. For me, only matters in as much as it actually affects you off the court. So, like, I could say, hey, I think if you're a jerk on the court, then maybe you're not going to be the happiest person for the rest of your life. But if that's not true, then it's like, well, then I think the responsibility is for you to be, the best competitor that you can be.
Well, I think there's a part where we have to do that within the social and rules constraints of the sport too.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's what
I
I
mean,
mean.
there's aspects of
I'm a
that where I
competitor.
think we could, we could take what you just said maybe to a place that's not so great, or
Don't win at all cost. It's be the best competitor you can be.
right,
Right. So for me, that's why I use the word being a competitor, because being a competitor is within the rules of the game. It's within the norms of the game. Right. And then there's potentially like soft gray areas, like hitting an underarm serve or something, which is like,
that's
you
not
know,
really a gray area to me. I mean, it's a tool. There's
it's
nothing.
totally within the rules. Yeah, but you can imagine, say, like, I don't know, in the 1930s, it would have been like completely like you're kicked out of the All England club, like you're not allowed to do it. It was unsportsmanlike or something. So my point is, like, some of the cultural norms can change, and
Sure,
so
they evolve over time.
our rules evolve with that to some degree, and what's acceptable does to some degree. But I think it's like within the rules that's set out there. I think it's be the best competitor, which for me is you've got to get yourself into the best mindset to play your best tennis. So,
Right.
like, I think there are a lot of people that are highly critical of Novak's attitude when he is playing his best tennis. Because I don't think that his attitude when he's playing his best tennis looks anything like Roger Federer, say, for instance, right?
Hmm.
Or anything even like Carlos Alcaraz. Like, Carlos is like laughing and joking around and like going for flashy shots, and he's emotive in this certain way where everything is sort of a positive, like fun-loving kind of thing. And I think Novak's best tennis is coming when it's him against the world and he's fighting his balls off. And like, for me, there's nothing to be critical about that.
Right.
Like, I don't think one is inherently better than the other just being on the court.
No, I think, like you said, there's the part where the way that we respond emotionally on the court in these stressful situations is very much tied into all of these formative experiences that we have, as children, as young adults, in our journey that we have. These things all shape us, and they combine with, I think, some of just our inherent neurological tendencies,
Yeah.
and you put those things together, and everybody's going to have their own triggers and their own things that push them into something approaching a flow state, and it's up to everybody to find what it is. I think, like, the competitor conversation is an interesting one, because I think there's very much, especially in American culture, I don't know, this is going to change around the world, but very much that idea of being the best, that you find maybe not just where the edge of the rules are and the edge of what's socially acceptable are, but it's much more about, well, you find the edge of what you can get away with is falls under the realm of being a competitor, and that's kind of acceptable
Some people,
in
some
some
people think that.
cultures. Yeah,
I don't feel that way. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
agree 100%. I think it's always bothered me in a way. Like there's a part where, look, if it's a rule, it's a rule, and just because you can get away with it doesn't mean that you should. And if I'm going to break a rule in order to beat you, then we're not playing the same game anymore. And therefore, I'm not, and when I think about what it means to be a true competitor, like a true competitor, it's, I want a level playing field, because then if I beat you, I've beaten you straight up, right?
Right.
If I beat you because I was willing to bend rules or break rules just because and because I knew I could get away with it, we're not playing the same game anymore.
Yeah, it's not game theory, right? Where it's like, hey, let me abuse this person as much as possible to just achieve a singular goal, right? Like it's specifically being a competitor is no, we're going head to head under the same set of rules.
Right.
Like that's part of the guidelines, right? So it's a different thing to sort of win at all costs. Like let me go outside the rules to get things done. I think that really undermines your integrity in a different kind of way. And I think that does affect you off the court, by the way. So, like
Yeah.
that's something that we talk to with the players that we work with. And like, especially if you're in the pros, you can't afford to do that in the long term, because that comes back to really hurt you on a personal level when it's your job, when you're out there competing. But
Yeah.
yeah, back to this thing that you were saying about how we're shaped by all of our past experiences and our childhoods and growing up and all these things, because we all know a lot of stories about Novak and how he grew up basically like in a war-torn country, and there were all these, there's bombs going off, there's poverty, there's a lot of terrible things around. I think it's really interesting to me, and it really stands out how I look back on, say, my childhood, and I look back on the stories I know from his childhood, and I don't think that we could be any more different, right?
Right.
My childhood was like as stable as you can imagine. It was white picket fence, next to the church in America, food on the table every night, family dog, mom, everything was there. And the interesting thing to me though is, if I'm honest with myself and I ask myself, okay, what kind of mental state do I need to be in to perform my best? I think I'm probably going to a pretty similar place that I see Novak going. I
Right.
think that's one of the reasons why I recognize it. And so it's easy, I think, if we look at Novak, especially if we want to judge from the outside and say, oh, well, let's levy some criticisms because look where you have to go to play your best tennis. But it's like, I mean, I had what I
Yeah.
would consider an idyllic childhood on a little island with like plenty of everything. And it's like, I want to go to the same place. Like, I respond better if it's a fight than if it's comfortable,
Well,
basically.
I think that there's a piece to this that's really important. If we want to start getting into a little bit of nuts and bolts on things that might be helpful for folks listening to help them manage their own situation on court, is that when we think about nerves and the role that they play in the context of competitive tennis as a flight or fight response, or as we like to say, fight, flight, or freeze response, it, what we're really trying to do in a lot of ways is come up with strategies that help us handle a lot of the physiological responses that are a part of fight or flight. And I think at the end of the day, one of the things that we know, right, is that when it comes to the central nervous system, that there is a spectrum. And on one end of the spectrum, you have people who are hyper anxious, and the anxiety center of their brain is just on overdrive all the time. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have people whose response is severely tamped. It's they're under responders, right? And and we see that the people who go on to become like base jumpers and freehand, mountain climbers where there's no rope, and if they fall, they die, and do these kinds of super high risk activities, tend to be people who have this under responsive central nervous system, where it takes a lot to get their heart rate up, from an emotional response. It takes a lot to get their fear response to kick in any sort of a meaningful way, which is why they're drawn to these super high risk activities, right? And so when we look at that piece, that central nervous system piece of the puzzle for tennis players, you have to understand at least a little bit yourself where you lie on that spectrum, because very, very few people are like dead center in the middle of that range. We most of us tend to skew a little bit one way or the other, right? We tend to be very risk averse or extremely risk tolerant as a result of that. And that's not a cultural piece, that's a brain function piece. And
Right.
and certainly I think that we can develop those brain functions as a result of experiences. People who have had very traumatic experiences tend to get driven towards one extreme or the other, at least a little bit,
Sure.
as a part of that, whatever their trauma is. And it's very few people who make it to adulthood without some degree of trauma, and maybe being nudged one way or the other. And so then we start to really
Yep.
ask, well, where on the spectrum am I? Because it might be that if I am a little bit on that suppressed side of the spectrum, that I need to get into very much that fight, fight, fight mentality to play better, because that's going to get me up to an excitation level, kind of an agitation level that lets me override fears and kind of do a good job. Whereas other people may need to be in a super zen state where they've got classical music playing in their head, and playing a competitive tennis match is more like a ballet performance. And that's where they're going to play their best tennis, right? And I think it's important to understand that about ourselves to get a better sense of that. Because like Nadal to me is not, he doesn't seem to me one of these people who has that really kind of low response system where he needs to be hyper jazzed to play. I think he needs to be physically very pumped up, but I don't know. To me, he doesn't seem to really thrive in getting like the crowd involved against him or anything of that nature. I think that's more likely to bother him than it is to help him. And we obviously, given what a great job he does, just generally how likable he always has seemed to be, like having the crowd strongly against him is a very rare thing. I think basically, short of playing playing Roger on Wimbledon Centre Court, he's probably going to be pretty popular.
Crazy. But he does do really well if the crowd is for him. Like
Yes.
the guy doesn't lose, like the guy didn't lose the Davis Cup match until until he retired.
Right. No, for sure.
Right.
For sure.
So there's a way where he might not respond well to hostility the way that Novak would. And there's we're using Novak just because he's Novak. It's just because everybody knows him. He's not the only guy.
No, but I think, and speaking to with this idea of like, I think he is maybe the best performer in hostile environments that I've ever seen, or close to it in any sport. And so he's worth talking about. Again, not as any sort of a negative thing, but let's acknowledge that his tolerance for hostile environments is through the roof compared to most people.
Yeah.
And that's worth acknowledging, because I mean there is something there. Right. I mean, he has played and look, some of the hostile environments that he's played in, he's contributed to, for sure. To be fair, there's other times where he hasn't, but regardless of whether or not he's contributed to helping kind of rile the crowd up or create that sort of an environment, like the reality is that he responds really well to it and he has a high tolerance for it.
Yeah, but look, I mean, there's nothing intrinsically bad about having the crowd be hostile to you, right? Like, part of the reason there's lots of different dynamics that can happen where the crowd can be against you, right? So it could be like you just go to a Davis Cup match and you're playing for the other country, they're automatically against you.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
They're cheering for their country, they're cheering for their team, so to say, right? It could be because they don't like you, which sometimes is what Novak makes it out to be, or sometimes people make it out to be like that about Novak. But it also can just be like, hey, you're winning and we want to see more tennis. So it's like, now we're going to root for the guy who's losing. I mean, he can be on both sides of that. So we've seen that like in Australia, where he was one of the most popular players for years. Sometimes the crowd would turn against him just because it was like they just want to see a competitive match, because he was just blasting through people. And it was like,
right.
It wasn't competitive enough for them, in the sense of like the outcome didn't feel like it was in question. It just felt like, oh man, like Novak's going to beat this guy 3-3 and 3, and I just paid $1,000 for these tickets, and
Right.
I
And Australia, like in
more
the culture in Australia, is like, I mean, we love an underdog. Uh, like
love it.
love
But the point is,
underdogs
like,
in a very
that's
meaningful way.
nothing that will get the crowd against him, and it's not because of something bad that he's done,
Right, for sure.
right? It's
Yeah.
like it's the dynamic of sport. Like we need to be able, as spectators, I think, to change who we're cheering for and go back and forth because, I mean, it's like that's the whole point, right? Of going to see the gladiators.
Well, I mean, here's the reality to me is I think that over the course of his career, Federer probably very, very, very rarely played in front of hostile crowds, right? I mean, obviously a very beloved player, but that's not the norm. And I think that especially if you play Davis Cup, most professional tennis players are going to experience hostile crowds in some form or another, even if that hostility is merely that the crowd cheers in a very one-sided way. Not necessarily that they're booing or doing anything, but I mean, I think if you and I know that you've seen this with Roger center court at Wimbledon, where the cheers for him. It's not that they're necessarily cheering against the person he's playing against, but it's just that the cheers for him are 3 times as loud as they
Yeah.
are. But that if you're the other player, that can feel very hostile, even though there's not any actual tangible hostility behind it, right? It's like it's
Yes.
really just a lack of enthusiasm.
Yeah.
But obviously, if you're the person on the receiving end of that, it doesn't feel good. And I've been on the receiving end of that in tennis matches, and it doesn't feel good. It does take on a feeling of hostility, even though there's no active hostile, action or words being used. It's just the nature of the beast, right? Um, and so yeah, I think the reality is that most professional players experience hostile crowds at some point in their career, usually throughout their career if they're on their Davis Cup team, playing in other countries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But Novak is exceptionally good. He responds exceptionally well to those circumstances. But let's talk a little bit about Rafa, and because I think there is something to be said for, at least something that's worth addressing explicitly about the way that he does use ritual and routine to kind of manage his emotional state and get himself in the right mindset to play, right? Because that's an
So
established tool.
what do you find so interesting about that?
Well, it's not that I find anything so interesting about it. I just think it's worth talking about. It's worth making explicit because there's probably people listening who don't use ritual or routine to get ready for the matches, and they don't understand why they're all over the place from one match to the next. They don't understand I played super well on this day and terrible this day, and physically everything was pretty similar, but they just had very different emotional states. But it's like, well, we did these 5 things before you played on Saturday, and then on Wednesday when you played, you didn't, or you did these 5 different things, and one of them sets you up to play well for
Mhm.
you, and the other one doesn't. So let's do the things that contribute, right? I mean, I think that's an important conversation to have.
Mhm.
I think it's such an intrinsic part of our world that we don't even really think about it probably that much, or maybe we don't necessarily recognize how important it is to talk about it explicitly. But I think it is huge. I mean, I think like Rafa's water bottles are a big deal. Not just because it's funny and haha, look how he lines them up the same way every time, he's so particular about it, but for him, it's part of the ritual around competitive tennis that helps him get in the competitive mindset. And I think that's the piece I want to talk about, is this idea of using routine, using ritual to trigger emotional states, trigger mental states, um, because that's how we can have consistency in our performance.
So like the water bottle thing is good for him specifically then?
Yeah, I think so. I think as long as it doesn't get to the point of like obsession, sure. I mean, it's just part of his preparation. It's part of how he manages his match, right? I mean, he's just lining his ducks up, so to speak.
So then, okay, so that makes sense. Do we think with him in particular, like, do we think that it is obsession? Like, has it crossed the line?
That's to be honest with you, I don't know. I can't say no definitively because,
Because because I can tell you what I hear in the locker room.
yeah, well, I know, and I've seen. I mean, I'm sure most people who care enough to have probably seen I can't even remember who it was that was playing him that walked by and like tipped his water bottle over on purpose
Uh,
just to upset him. Um,
and he was like, that was genuine, I think.
well, but also there's a part where like That's a pretty disrespectful thing to do,
Look,
right?
I'd be upset if I'm upset if like my kid picks up my water bottle in my own house. Like
Well, but I think
if my opponent
I
messes my
think coming back
water
to our
bottle.
conversation earlier about what it means to be a competitor, right? I mean, like that's crossing the line to me. Is like you're messing with somebody else's stuff with the intent to upset them,
Yeah.
and it's not in the context of the competition. It's not like, oh, I played a shot that you didn't like and it won me the point. It's no, we're in between active competition and you're messing with my stuff in a time when we're not supposed to be interacting with the
So the
intent of
question,
upsetting me, just so you'll make me play worse.
yeah, so the question is, so I think I know like how you would respond to this. Like I think like if I saw somebody do that to you, I think you would actually get emotional because you would feel like you said, like you're crossing a line and now you're
Yeah,
playing basically BS mind games. Like you're trying to play mind games with me outside of the rules that don't have anything to do with the tennis. And it's like I've
right.
lost respect for you and for your I've lost respect for the way that you compete.
Yeah, I wouldn't
Now,
care about the water bottle at all. It's more about the
yeah,
disrespect of it,
that's
right? The
so
intention of
that the
disrespect.
question is when that guy did it to Rafa, and he's not the only one, like other people have tried to mess with his water bottles. Do you think that he's responding like you, like, oh, that's unsportsmanlike. I don't have respect for you? Or do you think he's actually just like, my water bottle cannot be in a different position, more in like a, like if you mess with like an OCD person or like you take an autistic kid and like move their stuff, they're not like thinking, oh, you're playing mind games with me. They're like, no, the stuff is in the wrong place. The stuff being moved upsets me,
Right.
right?
That's a really good question. And I,
This
I don't have a clear answer to that. Like I really don't, because here's the part that's
we
hard
can't
for
we
me
can't
is
know for sure.
no, we can't know for sure, but also that I think like that Rafa is deeply rooted in respect. And
Yeah,
there's
very much
a
so.
way in which that's a very deeply held value for him. And so that's I think what makes it harder to kind of separate out how much of it is what. I do think my personal opinion is that
Yeah,
there is an element of
that,
these things are in the wrong place and they
yeah,
need to be fixed. I think there's a part of that, and there's a part of it that's the disrespect. And I wouldn't say that the water bottle thing is to the point of being to a detriment or a distraction. Um, I do think it's to a point where it's comparatively, if you want to get to him, right, like there's an easy way to do it if you're willing to be a jerk about it.
yeah.
And that
Like
that's kind of an exposure in a sense.
here's what I would postulate that if I was playing Rafa, okay, so if I'm playing Rafa, even now while he's retired, I'm not winning any games on any surface in any circumstances. Just to be clear, okay, and
Right.
you know that you can laugh because you know it's true, but I just have to say it
Oh,
because
sure.
like some people don't realize the gap. Like they just don't. Like I was talking to a local guy recently who was trying to tell me that like I was going to go beat like a current D1 player, and I was like, you just don't understand. Like that's not how it's going to work.
Right.
Like I'm not going to beat that guy. But anyway, so like the gap is massive. Okay. So if my life depended on it, or for some reason, if I could get around all my ethical quandaries, because I wouldn't ever actually be able to do this. But if somehow I could, and I needed to figure out a way to beat Rafa or like win some points at least, I would be like, I think if I just knock that guy's water bottles over every chance that I get on purpose, like he might not finish the match.
I think he'd
You know
finish
what
the
I mean?
match.
Like
I don't think
if
I don't
I
think it
did
would
it
be that disruptive to him, but I
like
I do think he'd win more points.
it's the first time he'll be like, and he'll be all respectful. But I think if you go back and do it like 4, 5, 6 times, I think he's gonna like his head might explode. He'd be like, "What is happening? This is not allowed." Like I think he might be like calling the like whatever tournament director is
Oh,
involved
sure. I mean, I think
over.
if you're at an actual tournament, I think, but I mean, but fair go at that point. I mean, I think that's a reasonable response. I don't think that he would be so distracted by the water bottle situation that was something from. I don't think he'd have some sort of neurological freak out. I think it would just be such an escalation of inappropriate behavior
I
that it would
think I
become
think
extremely disruptive.
I suspect he would have a freak out. Like in a way that I think a lot of other players would just be confused. Like, this is what are you doing? I'm just gonna beat you 0-0 and move on. And then like if I imagine like if I did that to Nick Kyrgios, like I think he would laugh at me and then swear at me and then he would hit aces.
Right.
You know,
Or maybe hit you. Who knows?
yeah, I mean, he might just hit me on the fly, but like but again, like touche, right? Like, okay, like
Yeah.
tit for tat kind of thing. It's like that. There's actually a very strong logic to that kind of response where I think I get a sense at least, and I think that some of the players in the locker room get the sense that Rafa would actually be like, whoa, like I'm gonna stop play to address this, which I think is like an interesting aside.
Well, I
Just
mean,
because
I would stop play to address it. I don't give a crap about my water bottles. Like I don't like I've never been that person where I cared, like things had to be a certain way.
yeah.
Certainly you could ask my wife that and she'll tell you that I don't care unless it's arranging things in the dishwasher, but then it's about efficiency to me. I want them to be washed properly, right?
I
I
was
want
gonna
stuff
say
to come out clean.
you
But like I've
definitely
never cared, I've never
a
been that
certain
person on a tennis court where I needed the balls to be a certain way or this or that. Like
right.
it's just about the behavior to me. I would 100%, if somebody kept knocking my water bottle over, I'm 100% stopping playing and addressing it, right?
Interesting.
But it's not at all to me about, the water bottle has to be in a particular place. It's
Right.
100% about the behavior because it's crossing the line. And then if you're going to choose to cross the line over and over and over again, then no, we're going to stop playing. We're going to address it. So, but I hear what you're saying. I mean, like you're suggesting that you think that there's kind of such a deep attachment to the water balls being in specific locations in
Yeah.
specific orders that it would be neurologically upsetting to him to have
Yeah.
them disrupted.
That like it could put you on tilt.
See, but I don't. The question that I have is like, I've never paid attention in practice, but does he do the water bottles exactly that way when he practices?
I well, it's not accurate to say exactly that way. That's too broad, right? That's too vague because you have a different number of bottles. Like you have specific numbers for matches. Like you go in
Sure.
prep like for 5 sets and 3 sets and whatever. He definitely has, we'll say routines because we don't know that they're obsessions, but either routines and or obsessions for water bottles in practice too.
Okay.
It's not just there. It's like it's a thing. And for me, this brings us back to Novak, and it brings us to what I think is really a fascinating question for me. That this is something that I actively try and figure out, and that I actively talk to players on tour about. I think when Novak is faced with a hostile environment, his response to that is basically to say, "Screw everyone else outside of me," and he doubles down on himself and essentially doubles down on who he believes himself to be.
Okay.
Okay. But in a certain way, his response to hostility is to be more himself. It's to be more genuine. And sometimes that means being angry. But it's genuine. Like we feel like
More authentic.
it's authentic. Yeah. It just feels like, okay, this is authentic him. He's being himself, whatever he's doing. And so there are times then when something funny happens and he laughs. So there are times when he's lighthearted. There are times when he's very angry. There are times when he's sad, but they all feel authentic. Right? It just feels like he's not being performative anymore. He's not being who he thinks he's supposed to be. He's just like, okay, well, nobody here likes me. It's me against the world. And so therefore it's like, I'm just going to be me. I'm going to do my thing,
Mm,
authentic. And I think that's a great advantage. I think in living in that authenticity is specifically what allows him and unlocks his highest levels of tennis.
right.
Rafa, I look at the water bottles, and my question is, well, what about this thing actually benefits you? I can see how it could have started as like, hey, I'm going to like get all my ducks in a row and have my routine, and I have this repeatable thing, and it's like that's great.
Yeah.
I wonder, like, is there a part of it where it's like, okay, now I am being even more authentic. I'm being myself. I'm living sort of my best life while I'm out here on the tennis court, and I'm able to therefore get the most out of my tennis? Or is this actually disconnected from that thing? And that's one of the questions for me when I look at routines or habits that players have is, okay, is this habit really serving you?
Right.
And
Well,
and
yeah, that's a good
out
that's a good question, right? And I think one of the things when it comes to routine or ritual, that's important to note is that the power in it lies in the consistency, right? Like if you're going to use routines or rituals to help control your emotional state or prep you for a particular mental state, the consistency is critical for that, or else it starts to lose its meaning. It starts to lose its effectiveness. And so, him bringing the same kind of water bottle management system to his practices isn't a sign to me of obsession inherently. It's not to
No,
say that it's not obsession. There's a question of
right.
it, at some point that does it start across the
Well,
line for him specifically?
just to be clear, the sign of obsession is the emotional response to it, not the fact of the
Right.
consistency. I love the consistency.
Yeah. And I guess this would be the thing to me is what makes it really hard to separate out is the fact that, as we were talking about earlier, another player coming by and messing with his water bottles, as much to me, like I said, I would also get upset. It's the intent to disrupt in a way that's inappropriate for the environment is what would be upsetting to me. It
Yeah.
wouldn't be about the actual water bottles, and so separating that piece out for Rafa is really hard because we don't know, which part of it's this versus which part of it's that, and how much is one versus the other, and we'll never really know. And so, I think that there's a
Man, I would
part
love it
where,
if we should get him on the podcast and ask him. We should just
yeah,
get it from him.
well, you
Like
can
I
you
would,
can make that outreach, see if you get any
but,
traction with it.
but
But
seriously, love it. He should talk about this at some point in an interview.
yeah, I think that's it. This is where I think I really wish that um, the tennis world and the tennis broadcasting world would embrace maybe some different people having conversations and different people having access to players to have better conversations and ask them some of these things. I think that are actually really kind of important questions, and talk about things that are actually
Yeah.
really important things to talk about. But
Well, just let the guys actually be authentic and be themselves instead of
right,
like,
that too.
hey, give PR hit points, you know?
Yeah.
We turn them into politicians and they're
Well,
just
but also
people.
if we ask them the same questions over and over and over and over again, anybody's going to start giving the. Look, you're going to be one or two things. You're either going to start giving the same kind of answers because it's easier, it's less effort, it's safe,
Right.
or you're going to have fun with it,
Yeah.
and there's not
Be like,
really a whole lot of space for much in between. Because I mean, especially when you just do interviews after every single match and you're required to do them, and journalists keep asking the same tired questions. I mean, there's a part where I think most people are just at some point going to start giving kind of canned answers, especially if it feels like it's high stakes to maybe say the wrong thing. And if you have any sort of media training, right, you get warned about that. So, and
as a
discouraged from
side note,
being creative.
it's not just like after every match, because if you look at it, I think it's easy as a spectator to say, like, oh, well, you're only playing 20 tournaments a year. Like, you can answer these questions after every match. It's actually all day long, every day.
Right.
It's like maybe we're only seeing that TV, but it's literally like people from all different countries, all around the world, from all different media organizations asking you morning, afternoon, and night, anytime that like you're out anywhere, which is almost the entire year for those guys. So
Right.
it's really constant, it's really nonstop. It's the same thing like if you have an experience with one of them and you say, "Oh, Rafa didn't sign my autograph," or "Novak didn't sign my autograph." It's like you just got to understand that they can't walk anywhere without being asked to sign an autograph.
Right.
So it's like I guarantee you, like they're signing tons and tons of stuff. They're giving us a lot of time. They really are, especially those guys. There's lots of
Yeah,
times where
everybody
they
has their
can't
limits.
do.
I mean, like that's just what it is.
Yeah. So anyway, so
Yeah.
this is the interesting question to me is like, how does this stuff serve you? And I think the Rafa water bottle thing, and it's like all the things that look like ticks is like, are they really serving him, or are they more like they're these like little tick releases of anxiety that's built up in him?
Well, I mean, do we
And is
have
that so?
to? Well, I don't know that we have to differentiate necessarily, right? Because I mean, it can be both. Something can be both. It can be, but I mean, if you
Yeah.
look at the point of it, right? If it is some sort of an anxiety release, then it's serving its purpose. And I think like just to frame this, right? The idea is that if I come up with routines or rituals that I follow before every match that I'm consistent with, that I know help put me in a right mental space, um, then it helps create consistency of performance. And one of the things I used to love to do when I was playing in juniors and playing in college is on match day, before my match, so I'd lay out everything I was going to wear in the match on the bed, right? And it would be shirt, shorts, socks, shoes at the base of the bed. And then
Okay.
I'd go have my shower and then come out and dress, right? And it was
Okay.
just something about that ritual of laying the match clothes out and seeing them there and having the shower, coming out and being clean and fresh and putting those clothes on in order. And it wasn't obsessive, right?
Hmm.
I could not do it. I wasn't going to be upset about not doing it. But the ritual of doing it kind of put me in a certain mindset because it triggered this idea of, well, I only did that on match days, right? I didn't do it for practices. I did it for matches.
Right.
And so it like triggered a match mentality for me. It was like, okay, when I played in college, it was just a full-time first, second serve volleyer. I needed to be in a very like combative mindset. And I was never like combative, like I'm going to argue with my opponent kind of combative, but I needed to be like high energy. I needed to come out with like a warrior mentality of, like I'm going to come into the net. I'm going to come at you like
Yeah.
over and over and over again. If you pass me 50 times, then congratulations, you beat me. Right. But you're going to have to pass me 50 times. And like, I
Yeah,
needed,
you're asked 50 times.
I needed to get like in that mindset to be able to go out and just keep going. Right. Because I played line one and line two my entire college career, and it was you're playing against people who can come out like there were players who could come out and blast returns and string together lots of good points, and so I couldn't back off that, right? And so like that ritual helped me get in this mindset where it was like, okay, it's go time. It was almost like for me putting on armor before battle, right? That was a little
Hmm.
bit of kind of like how it felt to me in that moment, and that created a feeling that helped me go out and play well. And so like that's the idea of using a ritual, right? Like I found that doing that, I discovered that in juniors that doing that felt to me a little bit like, again, putting my armor for battle. I'm going up to my fight, helped me play better. So then I incorporated that before every match. Now that's an example of a ritual, a routine that I would do pre-match that helped me. Now you might find others, but the goal is that there's a consistency there. That if I find doing that puts me in a mental space that I play well in, I want to find other things that help put me in that mental space that I play well. That's the point of the rituals and the routines, right?
Yeah.
Now, without hopefully becoming obsessive about them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they need to be sustainable, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And also like you don't want it to become to the point of dependency either, right? Like just heaven forbid, but imagine, like a stray bird crashes into Ruff's water bottles and knocks them over or destroys them in some way. I'm just coming up with an absurd example here, right?
Yeah.
If it's an emotional or mental dependency and something external can happen to disrupt that,
Right.
and the disruption becomes so upsetting to you that it negatively impacts your performance, then I think at that point you've got a little bit of a problem, right? It's
Right.
problematic. You're problematically dependent on it. If I didn't lay out my clothes, it wasn't like, oh my god, the world's ending. I had
Right.
other tools I could use to help create the mindset. I used music, which is another one just for people at home. Like you can use music that helps get you in the right mindset. Like I used to use a lot of movie soundtracks actually, because like I think that if you're a composer
Brave.
for
Oh, right.
not Braveheart, but like if you're a composer for movies, like a music composer for movies, you think about John Williams, you think about Hans Zimmer, like the the sole purpose of that music is to evoke emotion, and usually very specific emotions because the music is tied to specific scenes, right? Like you're writing music for a particular moment in a film that's supposed to have an emotional response from audiences, and you're crafting music to help evoke that emotion, like support the swelling of emotion that the scene is also evoking. Like they're supposed to feed off each other. And so I always found that like movie soundtracks, like specific songs that were supposed to evoke a certain kind of response that was the kind of response that I would play my best tennis having, was really helpful for me as a tool. And that changed over the years because when I was younger, when I was in my late teens and early 20s, I found like I had to get really amped up before matches, like super high energy. And then as I got older, I found I'd play better when it was like a little bit more less amped up, more focused.
Okay.
And I had to kind of like adjust as time went on because I changed. And I think this is one of these things too, talking about Ralph, talking about Novak, like I changed as a person, over
Yeah.
that 10, 15 years, right? Like I had
Yeah.
different life experiences. My relationship with the sport changed, which meant then that my emotional response to playing matches changed. And
Yes.
therefore I played my best tennis in a different emotional state when I was 30 than I did when I was 20, which is
Which is
natural.
really important to understand, right? And this is something that like we just I know recently together we're talking to one of the pros about, and it's something that's been a theme I think for me for the last couple of years is trying to help these guys understand that they're going to go through that evolution as well, right?
Right.
And there's a tendency, especially when you get to a certain stage where like this is something that I know you and I have both experienced where people are working with us and then for after a while they feel like they have a ton of confidence in all the work that we're doing together. They feel like, okay, like we know what we're doing, we're making all this progress. It's like it's going great. There's this tendency then to kind of turn to you and say, okay, what's the answer? Like, how do I need to be as if I'm going to be that way forever?
Right.
And it's like, oh, the question is, how do I need to be today? Or maybe how do I need to be this week? Right? It's just a complete mistake, though, to think like, oh, I'm going to need to be in the same mindset when I'm 23 and when I'm 28 or when I'm, 28 and when I'm 38,
Sure.
because you're evolving as a person. I mean, let's hope, right? And it's just life isn't going to be that static or it's going to be the same way every time. It's going to be more a matter of where do I need to be right now to respond to everything that I am as a person right now.
Right. Yeah, I think that's really important. And when we think about whether or not you're a professional tennis player, we probably need to be doing some degree of evaluation on what's the mental state I'm trying to get into compete in on a weekly basis,
Yeah.
because that's going to change greatly depending on what's going on in my life.
Yeah.
If there's things that are happening in my life, right, like in a moment that are anxiety producing or super stressful, I might need to go out and play tennis in a calmer state than I usually do. Or alternatively, I might need to go the other way and be much more
Right.
agitated than normal. Part of that just depends on me, right? It's
Yeah.
you could put 10 different players there and get 10 different answers on. And I should say, rather than say 10 different answers, there'd be 10 different correct solutions, because
Yeah.
people don't always understand
Or
themselves well enough
I
to know that's what's
feel
right or wrong.
solution. Yeah, because well, I mean, we see this in the pros all the time. The reason that not everybody's number one in the world is because they don't understand it, right? It's not because
Well,
they can't.
and you could only
I
have
mean,
one
there's,
number one in the
yeah,
world too. It's kind of
yeah, but like, okay, the reason that not everybody wins titles, right?
well. I think
Not everybody
maybe
wins.
a better way to phrase it, a more accurate way to phrase it, be that the reason that more people don't become or reach a level closer to their potential or have less consistency in performance, right? Because I mean, I think there are some players out there, no matter what you do mentally, they're never going to win titles. They just don't have the weapons, they don't have the tools, but they're good enough to be solid professional tennis players, right? Make a living at it. But there's this question of like, well, how much am I leaving on the table? And not to sidetrack on this, but like some people leave a lot on the table because they're not willing to prepare physically the way they need to, with diet and exercise, et cetera, et cetera. Um, Others, I think, aren't willing to evolve the way that they train and practice. And then others aren't willing to put themselves in the right mental, emotional state to play good tennis.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah. So look, so this is not an obvious transition. This is something that's actually relevant to some of the players that I'm working with right now. Um, this is something that we talk about regularly is we check in on how we're dealing just with our life stuff and like what else is
Mhm.
going on in life because obviously we all have stuff off the tennis court. Um, and the touch point that we use to bring it back to the court is what happens when uh, we call it it's the business end of things where we get late into a match or late into a set maybe or very late into a match and we're down and we're under pressure and we're behind and it feels like maybe things aren't going so well, we have a plan. Okay. Like we
Mm.
went in with strategy, tactics, and a plan. How much do we stick to that plan? And how much do we end up saying, like, oh no, like, what's a really good idea is like first serve, drop shot, right?
Well, yeah, that's a good question.
But but the idea is like, how much do I decide on the fly while I'm under pressure? Like, hey, my plan actually that I spent weeks developing isn't good, and I just came up with something better, in these bad circumstances, and
Right.
and I'm good with that.
So to me, I think there's we have to have the skill to be able to differentiate. Did I have a good plan and I'm just not doing a good job of executing it, as in terms of like I'm not committed enough to the plan, and then I can just change my commitment level to it? Is it that I had a good plan and for whatever reason we talk about on any given day you might have 80% of your games going to show up, right? And look, if my plan is centered around my serve and my forehand and my slice backhand is not there that day, it doesn't really change things, right? But if one of the pieces, like if I just am not able to functionally execute the plan well with what I've got that day,
Yeah.
right? Obviously, at that point, I probably need to think about shifting plans. There's this question of is it that it's just not a good plan? Now, I think that we have the fourth scenario. I guess I've got it's a good plan. I have commitment to it and I can execute it. It's a good plan. I can execute it, but I'm not committed, right? It's a good plan and I just can't execute it, or it's a bad plan. Now, if it's category number one, then you stick with it, right? Maybe you have an emotional thing that's stopping you from being able to commit to the plan. Maybe it's a great plan, but it involves you serve and volleying, and you just don't feel comfortable enough to serve volley. Like you're feeling too tentative, or there's something that's stopping you from executing that
Yeah.
piece of the plan, right? Uh, it doesn't matter how good the plan is. If you emotionally can't execute it, you need to pivot, right? And we've talked about this before. This this mismatch between somebody's natural tendencies and like the tools of their game, for example.
Okay, but if you're gonna go there, then I would say then that falls into the category of like, well, that was a bad plan. You mismatched your plan with what you're capable of doing. So it's a bad plan for you. It might not be a bad tactic
Sure.
but it's a bad tactic and strategy for you because it's a mismatch with what you're actually capable of doing.
It also just might be a response to that particular moment too, right? I mean, it might not be that it's necessarily a bad plan for you under normal circumstances, but for whatever reason on that particular day or in that particular moment, you're having trouble committing to it. Not because you don't have the tools, not because it's not your game style, but maybe you just can't get yourself over the finish line to actually really follow through on it for whatever reason, right? I mean, I think but here's the thing to me, right? If you don't have the skill to discern which one of those scenarios it is, then you've got a problem. And I think that's
Well, yeah,
that's
that's
the
fair.
hard part, because I think that most people in those situations are having a fairly strong, whether or not they realize it or are aware of it, a fairly strong emotional response to the situation that is going to impact their ability to discern which one of those scenarios it is.
Well, yeah. So I mean, I think that's part of what's so interesting to me about this part of the conversation is this is one of the ways that I talk about mental toughness with a couple of other coaches is like that the mental toughness is being able to stick to your plan under the sort of adverse circumstances. And now there's a lot that's wrapped up into that because it's assuming I mean we're dealing on the pro level, it's assuming that you had a good plan in the first place.
Right.
Right. So it's like
Yeah.
there's always a scenario where it's like, hey, you just made a bad plan. I would like to think that you didn't get to the business end of a match without realizing, like, oh, this was a bad plan all along, and that's why I'm losing.
Well, especially at the pro level, like if you've got to the business end of a match, it's probably not a bad plan because you're at
Close.
the end of a set. Like it's yeah, and one of the things that I have found interesting, especially with amateur players, is that I think because we end up with a larger spread of abilities amongst amateurs as compared to pros, in
Mm.
that the gap between the guy ranked 50th in the world, the guy ranked 200th in the world is a lot smaller than the gap between a 5-5 player and a 4-5 player, right?
Wow. Yeah. Light years.
Light years. And so I think that so often for amateur players, they have or they enter matches with this poorly developed belief that if they go out there with the right plan, that they're just going to destroy their opponent. And when it's 4-all in the third set or the first set, for example, they're panicking. It's like, oh my god, the plan's not working because I haven't won the set already. And it's like, well, no, but 4-all's where
That's
you
probably or
if
work.
you're playing somebody who is around your ability level, who's also playing a pretty good plan, then 4-all's where you want to be, right? Because that means things are probably working all right.
Yeah. So speak to me in terms of some of your own experience in this. I want to dig way back to when you were a certain volleyer,
Yeah,
right? There are times when I know you've experienced like if a guy gets up a break, if he gets a little lucky or something, then like all of a sudden he's returning better because he doesn't feel the same pressure coming.
sure.
And then there are also times where maybe like you're chipping and charging a lot coming in return games very often, and guys are executing, they're just hitting huge passing shots, and it's like they can't miss. But then what happens? Like, oh, it's 4-all, it's 4-5, it's 5-all, it's 5-6, and now all of a sudden, like you've been coming in all day. How much do you see a totally different scenario as you've been sort of like building that pressure over the
Yeah,
course
yeah. That's
versus
actually
like how much do you feel like, oh, well, if I didn't win by the time I got to 4-all or 5-all, then like it didn't work.
right. Yeah, no, that's a really insightful question. One of the things that was really interesting as I think back is how guys' emotional response to missing the passing shot changed at 4-all or 5-all compared to at 2-all, right?
Sense to me, yeah.
That suddenly, the stakes are obviously higher at 4-all. You're running if you get down a break now, you're running out of time, right? And I think like that because of that, the stakes are higher. People felt a bigger emotional attachment to the outcome. Um, it definitely changed, and I think that was part of, you know, I don't know that this is 100% right, but I always just tell people I stayed back on two serves in college, um, not two matches, like two actual serves. Uh,
Dude, actually,
uh, so there
wow.
was a Spanish guy in my conference actually. So I played him two years, and big serve, big forehand, big backhand. And I remember playing him the first time I played him, and he blasted a couple of balls by me at some point in the match. I think probably midway through the first set, and I thought, well, maybe I should try staying back a little bit. And I stayed back for like 2 points, and I was like, okay, that was a bad idea. And funny enough, I ended up winning that match. But then at Conference Championships, I remember he had a good day and he just blew me off the court, like two
That's
and
interesting.
two, 2-3, something like that. And it was just one of these things. Like he was on that day. He had more weapons than I did, and he played. It's funny because people think about. I mean, this is actually I think really relevant. People think a lot of times about serve volleying as being a very aggressive play style.
Right.
But I never felt about it like that. I felt like he was a baseline. I felt like his play style was way more aggressive than mine was because
Here's,
my whole mentality, funnily enough, was I'm going to just make balls, right?
yeah.
I'm going to make first serves. I'm going to come in. I'm going to make first volleys. I'm going to make second volleys. And if I got a third volley, then it's probably a volley winner. But most of the time, if I got a first ball in play, a first volley in play, I was, most of the time I'm winning that point because it's really hard to pass somebody 50 times, 100 times.
Yeah.
You know, that pressure does build. So I always felt like I'm just going to keep putting. I just got to keep
But
making shots.
as someone who knew you around that time, like you weren't hitting winners on every first volley. You weren't even
Oh
trying to.
God, no! I wasn't trying to a lot of the time. If you left it, if you gave me a shoulder high volley, then yeah, it's probably going away. But
Yeah,
but anything else, like no, I just want to hear. I just felt like if I make a volley and I get closer than that, my chances of winning the point have gone up, and yours have gone down.
you were
Right?
playing positional. You were playing a positional game.
100%. It was all about that. I just felt like I'm just gonna get close to the net. I'm gonna close. I'm gonna get in front of the ball, and you're probably going to try and love me. And I've got a good overhead. I'm athletic and I'm tall, and I'll get back. I'll hit the overhead, and I'm going to win the point. And I just felt like the more that I do this, the harder it's going to get for you as the match goes on. I didn't feel like I had an aggressive play style.
Right.
Weirdly enough, despite serving and volleying, first and second serve, coming in off a lot of returns, I didn't feel like my play style was that aggressive in a sense because I had a very like I'm going to make a lot of balls mentality about it, right? And it's much more like you got to pass me.
Right. It was
And so
you built so much pressure.
yeah, absolutely, it was all about putting that pressure to me
All play.
and making you come up with the goods. And I
Yeah.
felt like, well, if I make you come up with the goods at 4 or 5 or, um, then that's going to get harder and harder to do as the match goes on as we get towards the business end of sets. Like at that point, I've been I've been serving in patterns. I'm setting things up. Because the whole time through the match, I'm not just trying to win the point that's in front of me. I'm setting things up for later too, right? Like I might be setting up the wide serve on the deuce court for 2, 3 service games and then pull it out when I really need it. Um, and so I always just felt like I was getting stronger as the match went on. But so your original question,
And you had a lot of clarity though in how your strategy was going to progress through a match.
right?
A lot of the places, I mean, we see this obviously. I shouldn't say obviously, but the fact is we see it a lot with amateurs. We also see it though at the highest levels of the pros, where we all can succumb to the same sort of emotional reaction that, oh, I haven't won earlier enough, or my lead isn't big enough,
Right.
right? Where it's like your advantage as a certain volleyer, like I know it would have been a nightmare to play you in a tiebreaker. Like it felt impossible to beat you in a tiebreaker.
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
so I think,
It's
yeah,
just from the other side. So your advantage there, though, it's like going to the casino and you have like 51% advantage. It might not be big, but if it's always there, it's like 51% is going to win,
yeah, yeah,
right? And it felt like you had that kind of advantage. And a lot of us respond and bail on our strategy and
right.
say, oh, it must have been a bad plan, or I must be having a bad day, or now I need to, do all these other different things. I think we give excuses to ourselves
Yeah,
to get away from the things that we do the best.
sure.
So,
Well, I
like
think this, yeah,
you work to give them clarity on what is the best thing for you, and then also like have clarity on what do you do if things aren't going well.
right. Yeah, yeah. So I think there's two important things to note. One is that, I mean, the guys that beat me in college, by and large, just were either flat out better than I was
Hmm.
or played like noticeably better on the day,
Okay.
right? I mean, I got outplayed, just straight up outplayed. And
You didn't beat yourself hardly ever.
yeah, I don't think I beat myself very often. I can remember one match where everything was in the tape. Like I felt like I was making great contact with the volleys, and it just was not my day, But aside from that, literally that one match, I just felt like if I got beat, I got beat. There was a guy from Shorter, Swedish dude who actually is here, and he beat the pants off me twice. Like I played him twice in college, and he smacked me around both times. Then years later, I actually played him in the Atlanta Senior Invitational on clay, which wasn't very helpful for me either. And he beat the snot out of me then too. But he's just a better tennis player than I am. I mean, what are you going to do? But I
Yeah.
think one of the other things that's really helpful about this is that I had a clarity of purpose and a commitment that my decisions were made before I walked out in the court. I wasn't making really any meaningful choices in the course of the match, right? And and
In
I
it.
and I think that's really
Now,
powerful, because
that's what
here's the
people
thing
need to know.
is that, and this is really, really important. Were there times in the course of my, and it's not that I went out there and played mindless tennis, right? But my decisions were much more about what ball am I going to come in on, which side am I going to approach to, how am I going to approach like returning this serve, and how, like that kind of thing. But the underlying core of it is I'm going to keep coming forward, right? That was decided before I walked on the court. And
You made some
so,
big moves before you started the match.
yeah, the big one, right? The big ones. And so in the context of the match, were there times that I might have been able to make a more optimal decision? Yes, 100%.
Sure.
However, I can't think of a time where I feel like, oh man, I really just came out and I got it wrong. You know, there weren't times where I thought, man, I really should have played that match completely differently. Because it was always at my worst case scenario was it was a good plan. That was my worst case scenario, was it was a good plan.
That's a
Um,
pretty good place to be, man. I mean,
Yeah,
most
well,
people
but I think that's part of the reason why I didn't really lose to people I shouldn't have lost to in college, except for the one time where I just couldn't get a volley over the net, right? But I think it says something I remember that. I mean, I'm 47 years old. This is a match that I would have played 27 years ago, maybe 28 years ago, and I remember it, right? Because I just couldn't make a volley that day. But outside of that, I don't think I ever really lost to anybody that I kind of quite shouldn't have lost to. Um, I just, I felt like I basically, all the guys I should beat, I beat, and the guys that beat me just played better than me on the day, and I can live with that. Uh, I think when you are committed to serving volleying all the time, there's a purity of purpose to that simplifies the game in a sense, right? Like, I struggled mightily after college when I went back and rebuilt parts of my game to try to play professional tennis with slower balls and slower courts, where serve volleying full time wasn't really feasible. And I was a functionally better tennis player in that I had a better serve, I had a better forehand, I had a better backhand. But I was a worse player for a while because suddenly I had more choices to make,
right.
right? And
And
I think also importantly, not having spent the last 4 years, really, I was more of an all-court player as a junior than like late in juniors is when I started pivoting to serve and volleying full time. Um, I say late in juniors, really, it was when I was in Japan. Um, but that I think when you're playing, I didn't have the experience at that level of making meaningful decisions about ground strokes and patterns and all these things. The experience I had at it were from when I was 15 and 16, where the level of tennis was different. And I had to learn new patterns. I had to learn how to work points differently. And I had to learn how to make these situational decisions that I didn't have a lot of experience making, because I'd served and volleyed so with such commitment and come forward with such commitment, that it was a different. All of a sudden, I'm just making different decisions. It was like playing a different game in a lot of ways, right? And I had to. It took quite a while for me to catch up on that,
Mhm.
you know. And so circling back, bringing this like all the way back to your question, there's a way in which I think the less commitment that you feel, the less kind of purity of purpose that you feel towards your own game, in big moments, you're more likely to question that, right? You're more likely to start to look as well. Maybe that
Yeah,
would be better. Maybe that would be better, right?
change it.
And then you're more likely to abandon maybe what is a good plan in those
Yeah.
big moments and suddenly hit the stupid drop shot. Or, like there's somebody that I work with here at Atlanta, and when he gets angry, he starts serving and volleying. And it's like, well, okay, but is that are you but it's not like, oh, he serves and volleys more because it's a more successful play. And it's not like he goes from serving and volleying like 15% of the time to serving and volleying 85% of the time. And it's like that, and he's not really aware of it, right?
Yeah.
And if you ask him after the match, he would not really know what you're talking about. Wouldn't be like, yeah, like I got frustrated and so I started moving forward more. It'd be like, hey man, like you more than quadrupled the amount that you're serving and volleying. It'd be like, what? Huh?
Without
Without realizing it. And it's purely from emotion. And I've
that's
noticed this pattern in him for years.
or playing you, yeah, yeah. Well, so look, I mean, from the sounds of it, it's pretty cool. Like you have something in common with Rafa and Novak, right? Which is like you had very, very high level of commitment and clarity in what you were doing when you stepped on the court.
Yeah, yeah. It's a much, much more fun way to play tennis than the periods where I was having to figure it out, Again, it was hard.
So look, I think that is a really interesting point that you make, and that's maybe the place that I want to start to wind it down here. But if you're an amateur player now and you're working on your game, I mean, if you're listening to us, like you probably care about getting better, is the reality, right?
If you've made it this far, probably.
Yeah. There is this sense where this doesn't get talked about a lot. If you're going through a real process of development and you're actually getting better as a player, there's this other layer to it where it's not just, oh, I hit my forehand better, or, oh, I hit my serve better, but it's actually like, oh, well, now I have these layers of decisions to make. I have more sophisticated plans. Like my emotional space of competing evolves.
Sure.
And it's a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, it can be a struggle if you feel like you have if you feel like you have lost clarity that you previously had.
Yeah.
Like what to do now. Like maybe like my forehand's better, my serve's harder, but I'm not winning as much as I used to. Well, what's up with that? It's like, well, you lack clarity in understanding what you're supposed to be doing. The other side of that, though, is that is what I think is so wonderful about the game. And that's what keeps me in it. Because it's like, oh, that's how I get to be a better person.
Mm.
That's like figuring those things out is how I feel more fulfilled and I feel more at peace with myself. And I get to do all this self-reflection and realize, oh, here's where I have to put myself in order to get whatever outcome is important to me.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a way in which like part of the game reveals who we are, right?
Yeah.
And also I think importantly, our emotional responses on the court can be a big reflection for where we're at in life or what's going on in our life in a lot of ways. When I see players who get disproportionately angry in matches, but then otherwise are like, oh, everything's fine. To me, there's either, okay, so you've got either some sort of serious unresolved childhood trauma that is surfacing in the context of your sport, or there's crap going on in your life right now that you're really kind of brushing under the rug or ignoring. And then you're using like mistakes or errors or losing matches in tennis as the opportunity, the window to let some of that frustration and anger and disappointment out as like almost like a release valve. So then you can go home and keep pretending like nothing's wrong. And, I think that's an important thing to maybe understand or know, right?
I think it's pretty cool because in that sense, like our tennis, I mean, obviously, like tennis is so much fun, but like our tennis can be a form of like self-therapy. It can be a form of self-treatment for our life. And then I think if we take it a level deeper, it can actually be even more than that. It can be more than just a release valve. It can
Right.
actually the vehicle for progress that we get to make to say like, well, I don't just want a release valve. Like I actually want to feel better about those things.
Yeah.
Like,
And enjoy the sport, like enjoy playing the game, like have a love for it. It's I think it's no coincidence, and we've both noticed this trend that the tennis players who go to therapy do better than the tennis players who go to sports psychologists. And that's not to disparage the sports psychology field, but here's the thing to me is the role of the sports psychologist is to provide somebody with some of the mental tools like ritual, routine, breathing exercises, stuff like that. But look, if you've got deeper underlying issues that are causing disproportionate emotional responses on the tennis court, then those tools are a band-aid. and
Right.
like you're trying to deal with things that are outside the scope of a sports psychologist, and so I think that's just an important thing to note, that emotionally healthier people are going to do better with sports psychologists, and people who have a lot of other stuff that they're struggling with, they're going to do better with therapy, and that's just a reality, right?
Yeah. Don't reach for the Band-Aid when you need a surgeon.
Yeah, and also don't necessarily reach for the surgeon when you need a band-aid. Um,
Yeah,
it's,
definitely
it's,
don't like it
it's
that way either. That's for
similarly
sure.
true. So awesome. I feel like that's probably a good wrapping up point. If you loved or hated what we had to say, please feel free to send us a note. Would love it if you
That's
left a review, whatever platform that you're listening to this podcast on. The good reviews always help. They help, I think, both motivate us and also just kind of help expand the reach. And that's what we're here for, is to, I think, kind of spread our love of tennis and give people tools to hopefully play it better tennis with.
Thanks for listening, guys.
All right. See you next time.